Thank you, General Nagaraj, for taking strike. I thought I would be yoked straight away otherwise. I would also much rather speak on India and Pakistan on the cricket field, because I suspect I know a little more about cricket than I do about this subject. But having sort of done my PhD on this topic, it's a privilege for me to be able to, in a sense, publicly defend it before this very discerning and eminent audience. I thank Mr. Das Gupta and friends at the BIC for the invitation. I must first acknowledge the presence of two gentlemen who've brought me this far in this particular venture. One is my Hindi master from school, Dr. Iqbal Ahmed, who pushed me to pursue my studies even while I was practicing. The second is my guide from Mysore University, Dr. Muzaffar Asadi. I'm very grateful that both of them are here today. May I request you to please give them a hearty round of applause. I am daunted by the presence not only of all of you, but these two gentlemen in particular. They're rather hard taskmasters. And as if that wasn't enough, my dad is also in the audience. Well, I want to set the tone by placing a few caveats before I start. I want to emphasize the word contrast as opposed to compare. I'm not here to pass value judgment on which is a better nation. We hear often commentators describing Pakistan as a failed state. Well, if Pakistan is a failed state, we have a few failed states of our own. And I find this increasing superiority complex vis-a-vis Pakistan and inferiority complex vis-a-vis China. We've often been reminded that China itself has many fires to put out of its own. It's not fixated only on India. And therefore, the sooner we give up that fixation, the better. The other caveat that I want to place before you is that I'm not here to defend Indian democracy as being ideal by any standard. In fact, democracy itself as a system has been regarded as one of the shallowest forms of governance. But be that as it may, if we do appreciate and value the liberal democracy that we have today, we need to perhaps reflect on why we've arrived at this stage. And it's here that I want to focus particularly on the role of the two armies. Here again, I want to caveat my submissions by saying that my endeavor is not to say that the Indian army is faultless, or for that matter, that the Pakistani army alone is the villain in the political space in Pakistan. But I do certainly want to emphasize the inverse correlation between the role of activist, that is politically activist armies, and the growth of democracy. What Samuel Huntington described as Praetorianism, or undue intervention of military forces in political spaces. Do pardon me if I use the word army too often. It's not in any way to sideline friends from the Navy and the Air Force. I'm only sort of using the word because when one studies Pakistan, at least in the context of democracy, it's the role of the army that becomes more significant than the other services. But take it from me, friends, when I'm saying laudatory things about the army, they apply equally to the Navy and the Air Force. So ultimately, friends, before I sort of get off the mark, as General Nagaraj mentioned, the most interesting part of this study perhaps is how two countries and two people cut from the same cloth have taken such a dramatically different trajectory. It makes for very interesting study in history. It makes for very interesting study in political theory. And if nothing else, I can assure you, it makes for very entertaining conversation. And I hope that we will have a conversation once I complete my presentation before you. Even as of 1987, more than 50% of nation states in the world were under military rule or had been under military rule at some point. The effort was to move towards liberal democracies. The difficulty arises when we understand democracy simply in terms of the electoral process or the holding of elections. Instead, democracy, as I've come to understand, is really what happens between those two elections. In terms of what institutions we build, what traditions we build, how we as a people engage with the government, and vice versa. And when it comes to aspects like this, civil-military relations are critical to the understanding of the growth of democracy. Here, I think the early history of the two countries is crucial. I like to call them the power play overs. If one is 30 for 4, as India usually is these days, then I think the game is up. On the other hand, if you're 80 for no loss, well, the game is there to be won. And interestingly, Lord Curzon never thought it fit to have an exclusive Indian officer corps. But based on the performance of our Jawans and soldiers in the World War, slowly the Indian Military Academy, the RIMC and so on started opening their doors to officers from India. And please remember, this is pre-partition India. So the same military academies that produced future generals of India also produced future generals of Pakistan. And why that is relevant to me is that, in a sense, the professionalism or the training of both the set of officers was one and the same. So it makes it even more interesting as to how one of those went the political way, whereas the other didn't. And we'll try and answer those issues. But the motto of the Indian Military Academy is what actually struck me, the Sir Philip Chetwood motto, which stands proud at the IMA, which begins by saying the safety, honor and welfare of your country come first, always and every time. When Sir Chetwood used the phrase your country, did he mean your country or did he mean your government? Did he mean that the army is unconditionally loyal to the government of the day? Or is it entitled to think beyond governance and think of the legitimate interests of its country? And I think these are some of the questions that will help us answer why these two countries went the way they did. General Sinha, of course, who's written profusely on these topics, had said that as far as the Indian Army was concerned, that is the British Indian Army, they saw fighting as their profession, they fought for their honor, they did not have any other cause to serve. But when we reached the stage of the separation or the division of the two countries, the question was whether we would have a united army. Pandit Nehru was opposed to an undivided army. I came across a very interesting anecdote, if you will, of Field Marshal Cariappa keenly pushing for a combined army that would, in his words, take over power with either Jinnah or Nehru at the helm as Commander-in-Chief. But Lord Ismay was not amused. He said the proposal was wholly impracticable and that the army must always remain servants to civilian power. I must say in Field Marshal Cariappa's defense that he was probably thinking aloud. He did later on describe politics in the army as a poison. He urged his soldiers to keep off it with a clear direction to them that they must serve the government of the day and not get mixed up with party politics. But at the stage of partition, when ultimately the divide took place in a 70-30 ratio, British officers commanded both armies initially. One significant factor that comes to mind is the fact that the combined Indian Army, or the British Indian Army for the want of a better phrase, did not involve itself in the active independence movement. This had two implications. One was that the forces themselves were, one could say, far removed from politics. The other is that the civilian leadership looked down upon them. I will try to show how the Indian civilian leadership at least viewed the forces, and you'll be quite surprised with the sort of allergy that they had to them. In fact, when the question of integrating the National Army, the Indian National Army, into the regular force arose, the military officers of the day were very strongly opposed to it. They said, no, the Indian National Army may have fought for independence, its cause may have been good, but ultimately it had a political avatar and it did not belong in professional soldiering. In fact, there's a very interesting anecdote of General Thimaya's brother having served in the Indian National Army. And when he was arrested, some of his colleagues teased him, saying, oh, you're going to get off lightly. He said, no, if I know my brother, he's probably going to give me a hot meal, a cold beer, and then throw me in the locker. And I expect that's exactly what he did. But do please remember that in this background, India already, that is post-partition India, already had a strong party system. You had the Indian National Congress with hardly any challenge. And you had very tall civilian leaders. You had Nehru, you had Gandhi, you had Ambedkar, Sardar Patel, and a longish list. Pakistan had Quaid-e-Azam Jinnah. And Jinnah, and I can say this in defense of Mr. Advani, he was, really taken to the coals when he said that Jinnah was a secularist. I don't think he was entirely wrong. Because Jinnah did have in his mind a democratic state based on secular principles, based not on bureaucracy or autocracy or dictatorship. Those may have been his early thoughts. He may have contradicted himself in thought and deed. That's a separate matter. But even someone like Rafiq Zakaria said that Jinnah's perception of democracy was more democratic than India's. But he says that he was let down by politicians and bureaucrats and army commanders. Well, be that as it may, Jinnah passed on early, and there was hardly anyone to sort of take the baton and run. And that caused a very significant vacuum in the early history of Pakistan, which gave way to the military to step into the political space. Being a student of the Constitution, I was amazed to find that Pakistan took till 1956 to have its first constitution. In that sense, our run rate was better than theirs. We had us as early as 1950. We had an election in 1951-52. We had the Indian National Congress squarely in power. And in that sense, democracy had already hit the ground running. Pakistan, on the other hand, was still grappling. They had the equivalent of the 1935 Government of India Act in force. As I said, it didn't necessarily have any democratic leadership or tradition to boast of. And more importantly, it had a sense of adventurism. Sir mentioned the 1948 conflict. Now, Jinnah, just before his passing, had a vision that Junagadh, Hyderabad and Kashmir would not merge with the Indian Union, but would in fact merge with Pakistan. And to quote him, he had dreams of riding in triumph into Kashmir. India, on the other hand, believed that if both Maharaja Hari Singh and Sheikh Abdullah joined the Union, it would have demonstrated the hollowness of the two-nation theory. Be that as it may, we chanced upon intelligence of the Operation Gulmarg, when the Pakistani troops, along with extremists, tribals, Lashkars and so on, made a foray into Kashmir. We in turn undertook Operation Rescue, pushed back the troops. There was a UN intervention which resulted in a ceasefire. There was also, the promise of a referendum that Pandit Nehru made on Kashmir, which, as he admits, caused him a great deal of heartburn later because he was not able to see it through. But the fact of the matter is that the army was already used by the powers that be in Pakistan for political purposes. And the Indian army, on the other hand, was confronted with a combat situation where they had to react militarily, and they did strongly. Now, another rather sore point is what would have happened if the Indian army was given a few more days. We've heard legends of very confident statements being made by our senior commanders at the time that we would have resolved the Kashmir problem once and for all. That didn't happen, be that as it may. But the important point here is, and I want to quote General Lehel, who says in the context of the 1948 war, that the Indian army continued by choice to remain away from politics and socially distant from the political class, which, and I want to emphasize this, continued to ignore the importance of the army despite its praiseworthy role during the near civil war conditions during the partition of India and the war in Kashmir. And the reason for this attitude of the government in ignoring the forces, I think, is again a very important aspect. King George IV, I had read somewhere, exempted his officers from raising a toast to him or from standing for the national anthem. He did this because the loyalty of the forces was beyond reproach. Pandit Nehru, however, had a slightly different take. Some of his earlier thoughts on the Indian soldier are a little disturbing. He describes the Indian soldier as one who resents the advice of others, and when he errs thoroughly and persists in error. For him, the chin is more important than the mind or the brain. Rather strong words and defamatory, I would say, as a lawyer. So therefore, he not only had a slight aversion to the Indian army and to the forces in general, he also distrusted them. Krishna Menon was brought in with an unwritten task which was, and I quote, to control the generals. I will refer to you later to certain letters that Pandit Nehru had written to Bertrand Russell and others, where he conveyed the sort of heartburn he had with the Indian forces, and I would say unnecessarily so. In fact, one of the suggestions is that Field Marshal Cariappa was appointed as High Commissioner in Australia because Pandit Nehru didn't want him anywhere nearby. Of course, his son, Air Marshal Nanda Cariappa, in his book, completely refutes the charge that there was ever any political adventurism that passed the mind of his father. Though Field Marshal Cariappa did contest an election in 1971 as an independent in Bombay. He stood against Krishna Menon and Acharya Kriplani, and he ultimately lost the election. One of the rare instances where such a high-ranking officer is in fact taken to electoral politics. And this brought us to the very crucial phase, I believe, in civil-military relations in India, which is the period soon before the 1962 war. I don't think ever in the history of India have civil-military relations been tested or strained like they were then. People are obsessed with General V.K. Singh's going to the Supreme Court and so on. I think that is honestly a storm in a teacup if one looks at the sort of developments that took place back then. And I'm at pains to emphasize some of these episodes in the common histories of India and Pakistan because I want to try and show that the Indian army has had several occasions, I won't use the word opportunities, but has had several occasions when it could have protested overtly against the government of the day, but it chose not to do it, which is important. And I think this period in, say, 59 to 61 or so, when General Thimaia was Chief of the Army Staff, is one such episode. General Thimaia and Krishna Menon strongly differed on China. Even when the Aksai Chin construction was on, Indian Jawans were being arrested and so on, Menon said, Pakistan is our only enemy. The Western powers are trying their tricks to make India fight China, but China will not attack us. He said this at a point when the Indian and Chinese troops had already clashed. He also said, Pandit Nehru in fact said, at an earlier point in time when Field Marshal Cariappa urged him to position troops along the border, he flared up. He's supposed to have thumped the table and said, "It is not the business of the commander-in-chief to tell the Prime Minister who is going to attack us where. In fact, the Chinese will defend our eastern frontier. You mind only Kashmir and Pakistan." Well, be that as it may, the famous or infamous Lieutenant General Kaul was already commanding the 4th Division. He was most graciously making a demonstration at Ambala for the visiting Chinese military officials. General Kaul, as many of you would know, was extremely close to both Pandit Nehru and to Krishna Menon. And he was, in a sense, the sore thumb that caused this breakdown in relationships. Be that as it may, when Kaul was promoted to Lieutenant General, contrary to the suggestions and recommendations made by General Thimaia, I think it was the last straw that broke the camel's back. General Thimaia put in his papers stating how impossible it was for him and the other 2 chiefs of staff to carry on their responsibilities under the present defense minister. Mr. T.J.S. George, who wrote a fabulous biography of Krishna Menon, says that General Thimaia was close to Menon prior to the Kaul episode. However, he had no doubt that the general believed in civilian authority over the military. Kaul, in his book, The Untold Truth, has a slightly different version to give. He glosses over the subject and simply says that Timmy could not get along with Menon. He ignores his role, as it were, in the plot. And when General Thimaia put in his papers, and this is something I got from Ram Guha's book, he says that the normally pro-government Hindustan Times also said that Krishna Menon must go and not Thimaia. It accused the minister of reducing the forces to a state of near demoralization by creating at all levels a cell of officers that would be personally loyal to him. However, Pandit Nehru prevailed on General Thimaia. He withdrew his resignation. That wasn't the end of the day. He was embarrassed again. He proposed the name of General Thorat as the next Chief of Staff. That decision was shot down and General Thorat was superseded by General Thapar. And what this entire episode did is, it showed the army its place. And it did it quite crudely. Intervention in military appointments and military promotions, I'm sure the General will tell us, is a sore point. And if the tradition, as it were, the nasty tradition started back then, I think there was cause for the forces to be aggrieved. Timmy, as we know, had the sort of fanfare and fan following that he could have provoked or inspired his boys to act against the government. He did no such thing. And please, ladies and gentlemen, don't be under the impression that the idea of a coup in India was so unthinkable. Today it is. And hopefully by the end of my submissions, I'll be able to explain why it is. But at that point in time, it wasn't so difficult. I can't remember where I read this. It was perhaps General Vaz or General Menezes who said that all one had to do, and this was just a theoretical, romantic creation of what a coup in India could have looked like. And he said all one had to do was take the main airports, take All India Radio, have the infantry in sync with the decisions, keep the other service chiefs in sync, and you could possibly have a coup. I understand it's simplistic, but I also don't think it's something that can be so easily ignored. And we've had many commentators and thinkers who have said that General Kaul in many ways could have staked a claim to have actually led the country forward. I mean, it's a shuddering thought. He could have been, as he says, the General Nasir of Egypt in India. But all of this, ladies and gentlemen, was in this crucial phase between 1959 and 1962. And for every General Kaul who was seen as the bad apple, I'm pretty convinced that the army as an institution never considered the thought of taking on the civilian government. And of course, contrary to the rather self-serving predictions that our civilian leaders made. China attacked us. We lost number of soldiers. I'm sure many of the senior officers here would have seen action back then. We lost a number of boys not only to combat but also to the climate, to the cold, on account of the very poor facilities that were given to them. It also, I think, brought to the fore some of the greatest gallantry that the Indian Army could have ever seen. People don't like to talk about the China war because it's seen as a loss. It's almost like a match that India's lost to Pakistan, and then you forget that brilliant 100 of 80 balls that Sachin may have got. But we had that sort of gallantry. Major Shaitan Singh, the Kumaon Regiment, over 120 boys out of a unit of about 124 succumbing, and all of them succumbing to bullets to the chest, not to the back. You must have seen the Rezingla commemoration that took place recently. And please also remember, ladies and gentlemen, that if we did lose in 1962, it was not simply because the army was underprepared or not a fighting force. We suffered because of the lopsided political leadership as well. We suffered because of the lack of vision. Only about 5% of our troops were deployed in 1962. For 4 divisions of the Chinese, we had 4 brigades. And quickly enough, the ceasefire occurred, the Chinese withdrew. They perhaps had a statement to make, and the rest is history. General Palit uses an interesting phrase. He says, the Indian Army enjoyed a mood of combative smugness after Operation Vijay in Goa. A question has been raised as to whether India would have tried to liberate Goa if the Chinese had already attacked before Operation Vijay. I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer. Be that as it may, there was the General Henderson Brooks committee that was constituted along with General Bhagat to go into the failings of this war. That report till today is gathering dust. General Kaul, the prime witness in the case, was not even summoned. They say he was shielded by orders from above. But this also did not either result in a change in heart of the armed forces who had suffered tremendously. I concede that the sufferance was not only because of political indecisiveness, it was also because of a certain lack of military leadership. But the allergy that the civilian government had towards the army also didn't go away. Pandit Nehru was still having sleepless nights. He had written, as I said, to Bertrand Russell, saying the danger of military mentality spreading in India and the power of the army is increasing, that they were conjuring up the Chinese bogey to get their demands through. General Harbaksh Singh, who was posted as the army commander of the Western Command, said that happened because the government of the day was anxious about General Chaudhary and General Sam Manekshaw, as he then was, planning a coup against them. The government also introduced counter-coup planning and roped in the Intelligence Bureau to assist it in this noble task. Even when Pandit Nehru passed away and General Chaudhary, as the chief of the army staff, ordered extra troops into New Delhi, just as a security measure, he was asked to show cause by the defense minister. It's a little bit like the recent bogey of Resina Hill being spooked, as a leading newspaper carried it. But to the credit of the armed forces, they took their loss in 1962 and the later indifference towards them on the chin. Perhaps the forces realized that they were to some extent complicit in the loss of 1962, came together with the civilian government, and the period between 62 and 65 significantly resulted in a development of better relations, the building up of military assets, intelligence, and so on. Now please contrast this to, as I said, the power play overs in Pakistan. Pakistan at its birth was a highly feudal and provincial place. It saw violence, provincial, sectarian, linguistic violence in Punjab, in the Northwest Frontier Province, because of the fallout between the Muslim League and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, in Sindh and in East Pakistan. I think those of us who see Pakistan as a monolith are in error. Pakistan is hugely divided in terms of class and in terms of language. In a way, I'm privately happy to say that it's the Punjabis who dominate there. Dad certainly will be happy because he was born there in Quetta, moved later on. But on the other hand, this sectarian provincial divide is something that the civilian leadership of the day couldn't tackle. And Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan saw great promise in Brigadier Ayub Khan, promoted him to Chief of the Army Staff. One of the many critical mistakes that the leaders in Pakistan would make in terms of choosing their confidants. Not only was Ayub Khan appointed as the Chief of the Army Staff, he made a rather ironic statement on such appointment to his troops. He said, "Keep out of politics. You must avoid taking any active part in party politics and propagation of any such views. We, that is the army, are the servants of any party that the people put in power." Hardly ever has there been a more ironic and paradoxical statement in contemporary history. Not just this, the appointment of the Governor General of Pakistan at this particular point in time was one Mr. Ghulam Muhammad, who was the Finance Secretary. He was a bureaucrat. Please also bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that while India enjoyed democratically elected leadership right from ball one, Pakistan had no such luck. So, the Governor General was a bureaucrat, one who didn't come through the ranks in terms of being elected by his people, which has by itself singularly affected the democratic prospects of the country. I only emphasize this because I want to again say that to say that the army in Pakistan is to be condemned as having diluted democracy is only a half-truth. There are others who have to take the blame. And when the leadership of the day couldn't deal with the growing provincial unrest, martial law was imposed in 1953, imposed by the Prime Minister. Just last night, I had a sort of a spine-chilling thought, because for me as a lawyer, I would like to believe I'm prepared for my case. And having done my PhD, it's rather embarrassing for me to confess that I never bothered to check if there was a provision in the equivalent of the Government of India Act or the later constitutions of Pakistan, in fact, providing for martial law. And there's none, ladies and gentlemen. But the imposition of martial law is, in fact, in a sense, a superimposition that took place ad hoc. It was questioned in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of Pakistan invoked the doctrine of necessity to say that what may otherwise be illegal becomes legal in case of necessity. A wonderful doctrine in a way. I know many chief ministers in India who have benefited from it. And it is this obnoxious precedent that has continued to be used to justify the imposition of martial law. So, if there was a villain in the piece in terms of the bureaucracy not having legitimacy of power, there was now another villain in the piece, which was the Supreme Court of Pakistan. It condoned it, and it continued to condone it through the history of Pakistan. I know I'm comparing the armies, but in comparing the armies, I'm also trying, as an aside, to compare the judiciaries. The judiciary in India has stood tall, especially post the 70s. As you know, in Keshwanand Bharati's case, the Supreme Court of India has said that the power to amend the constitution does not include the power to destroy it. And any amendment that Parliament makes is amenable to judicial review. And if an amendment violates the basic structure of the Constitution of India, the Supreme Court will and has struck it down. And that basic structure has been expanded from time to time to include democracy, secularism, judicial review, and so on. Credit equally to the government to have maybe reluctantly obeyed the orders of the Supreme Court. But that is the key distinction. You had a civilian institution. Democracy is not Parliament alone. Democracy is not elections. It is other liberal civilian institutions. One of those is the judiciary. I think that's where the contrast between the two countries comes through significantly. But be that as it may, the very induction of the armed forces to help the civilian leadership in Pakistan quell the local discontent is something that caused the army, to smell blood, as it were, to get a taste of power. And once that happens, there's hardly any looking back. Of course, Field Marshal Ayub stayed in power for a few years. In the typical soap opera that is Pakistan, soon he was regarded as an Indian spy. So, when he was away to the US in April 1958, his friends in Pakistan thought he was there to receive a commission from Jawaharlal Nehru. Sounds rather dramatic. And the plans of President Iskandar Mirza, who himself, friends, was a retired general, was to overthrow Ayub on his return. But what General Mirza didn't anticipate was that Ayub had a great deal of loyalists within the force, and instead the tables turned. Ayub Khan deputed two of his senior generals to visit President Mirza on 27th October 1958 at a very earthly hour of about 10 p.m. to extract a resignation from him, which he tendered graciously in his night robes. Field Marshal Ayub assumed power, made another of his rather ironic statements. He said, "My assumption of power was going to be viewed as by the outside world as a coup, which would have a damaging effect on the image and reputation of Pakistan. A well-organized, trained and disciplined army would find it extremely distasteful to be turned into an instrument for securing political power." But then he went on to confess, as conditions were, the army alone could act as the corrective force and restore normalcy. And he sought to do that. And this was built up on a fair amount of India bashing. India has been treated or created as, this Frankenstein that is out to swallow Pakistan, to make sure that the partition is undone, to usurp independence, and so on. And when passions run so high and the picture painted is so exaggerated, naturally it is military leadership that has more legitimacy. As I said, I'm only comparing the two democracies. I'm hardly commenting on how the leadership has been viewed in the respective countries. You will find many times, ladies and gentlemen, that the citizenry in Pakistan has regarded the army as its savior. It has not regarded its civilian leadership in the same estimation, as it were. And this resulted in Operation Gibraltar. Pakistan made another foray into India. It thought that the combat would remain localized. Prime Minister Shastri, however, had different views. He decided to precipitate matters, and ultimately there was a ceasefire that came to be declared. The Tashkent Accord provided for status quo ante, something that again caused heartburn amongst the Indian military leaders of the time. General Lachman Singh said that all the gains that we had made in Hajipur, Tithwal and Kargil, won with a heavy loss of blood and sweat, were returned to Pakistan at the political level. Be that as it may, there was no one-upmanship, there was no overt protest by the army. Matters went on as such. And it is this development of healthy civil-military relations, probably a greater degree of professionalism on the part of the Indian armed forces, that set the tone for our future democracy. Please remember, we were only about 20 years old at this period in time. On the other hand, Pakistan continued its soap opera. Ayub and Bhutto fell out. The East and West fell out. Pakistan is an extraordinary example of two states, two geographies, that is East and West Pakistan, being separated by hundreds of kilometers and still being one nation state. I don't know how many examples there are on the globe. But Field Marshal Ayub himself now, after the 65 war, lost legitimacy. He was overthrown by a discreet coup by one of his boys, General Yahya Khan. His residence was sealed, and he was given, well, to use a phrase from The Godfather, he was made an offer that he couldn't refuse, which was to resign or to face the consequences. Naturally, he resigned. Yahya Khan, friends, is a colorful character in Pakistan history for two reasons. One is that it is in his regime that Pakistan saw perhaps the fairest of all elections. One of the many paradoxes that you see in Pakistan. You see greater democratic tradition with a general in power than you do when you had the civilian leaders like Bhutto and Bhutto Jr. and Nawaz Sharif and so on. The other aspect is that General Yahya was supposed to have a strong interest in wine and what one of our leaders calls the dented and painted species. But that didn't stop him in any way from actually staying true to his promise to the people to hold an election, which he did in October 1970. An election that Sheikh Mujibur Rahman of the Awami League won with an overwhelming 161 to 163, as compared to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's 81 to 88 in West Pakistan. And this made the leadership in the West extremely nervous. Sheikh Mujib made his 6-point proposal that had a mix of federal and union distribution of powers. The government in the West was not excited about it at all. They saw it as a divisive step. They thought India was behind it. Perhaps it was, I don't know. Maybe friends from the intelligence can enlighten us on that. And ultimately, Yahya ordered his troops to intervene. There was a very honorable Major General Yaqub Khan who said the only solution to the present crisis is purely political. I am convinced that there is no military solution which can make sense in the present situation. Naturally, he was replaced by General Tika Khan, the famous or infamous general in Pakistan history. Of course, the troops intervened. India had to react. Mrs. Gandhi sought the advice of her general, Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, general as he was then. Please appreciate General Manekshaw's positioning. He was asked early in 1971 if we were ready for war. He said no. A point blank no, as was his style. He said they needed time to regroup. The monsoons had to pass. They were not fully ready, and that the Indian troops needed time till the end of the year. Please see the qualitative difference in civil-military relations now. The Indian Army, through its leadership, was able to differ with the political leadership, but it didn't question its decisions. Credit to Mrs. Gandhi and her squad that they didn't either try and impose their will upon the army or take any sort of precipitate action. In fact, the meetings that took place was so animated that General Inder Gill, who was the DGMO at the time, is claimed to have walked out of several such meetings saying that he just couldn't take the ceaseless chatter. That didn't affect his role as the DGMO, nor did it affect the way the Fauj or the government regarded him. And in the showdown in 1971, as you know, that's regarded by many as the first war that we actually won fair and square. 65 was probably stopped too soon to have a discerning or a clear verdict. Maybe we won it on points. But 71 was a knockout. The Navy was involved. It acquitted itself admirably, as did the Air Force, as did our troops on both the Western theatre as well as in the Eastern theatre. And the friends in Pakistan at that point in time were suffering a severe schizophrenia because many of the Faujis involved in the 71 ops feared that this entire 1971 showdown was stage managed by the leaders in the West to create unrest and in a way get rid of Bangladesh. I don't know how credible it is, but I can tell you I've read, and General Niazi's book called The Betrayal of East Pakistan makes a telling comment when he says that the entire blame for the political defeat was being passed on to the Eastern Command. How this was brought about militarily is a fascinating study of deception and double cross imposed on the Eastern Command by General Yahya, General Hamid Gul Hassan, Tika Khan and others. Be that as it may, the civil society in Pakistan remained a mute spectator to most of these developments. The Justice Hamadur Rahman Commission did indict the army for the lack of professional efficiency, being focused too much on military matters. But the loss was there to behold. And it's at this stage that General Yahya was now overthrown by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Bhutto came in as the chief martial law administrator, being a civilian. It's an interesting case study of the forces this time not bringing one of themselves to lead the country, but bringing, a civilian outsider. Bhutto also made some tall claims, as did most leaders while taking powers, stating martial law was required for the sole purpose of bringing basic reforms. Once this phase of reforms is over, the ground would be laid for the full flowering of democracy. Glorious words never seen in Pakistan. Bhutto, ladies and gentlemen, the civilian leader, proved to be one of the greatest autocrats in the history of Pakistan, more so than the generals who preceded and followed him. This he did by a series of actions that antagonized all around him. He went even to the extent of having his mentor, one Mr. J.A. Rahim, beaten up by his supporters because he had mildly criticized Bhutto for his feudal behavior. He replaced the army with the Federal Security Force, replaced in the sense he functionally replaced them. He functionally replaced the civil services by what he called the district management group. All of these were flowery metaphors for people of his own tribe to sort of implement his will. He promised Mrs. Gandhi, who he didn't particularly like, that his was the first democratically elected government answerable to the people. Perhaps he was an advocate at some point in time. But his rhetoric worked. The Shimla Pact was signed. He was, in a sense, on a good wicket. But he made a few fatal mistakes. He firstly relied on the army once again to displace the National Awami Party, which was getting more and more powerful and vocal in Northwest Frontier Province and in Balochistan. He went on to conduct elections in 1977, elections that were quite clearly rigged, though he said, I will not like to go down in history as a rigger of elections, a faux pas, as it were, where the rivals and the opposition colluded. But be that as it may, the Pakistan People's Party won handsomely despite his rigging, which means he could possibly have won the election even without having rigged it. But that somehow didn't take away the other itch that he had. He was increasingly uncomfortable with the Islamization of the army in Pakistan. General Zia was clearly and explicitly an Islamic at heart. Some folks have said that he changed the character of the Pakistan army by introducing traditions that were highly religious in nature. But be that as it may, when Bhutto intervened and tried and curb Zia from conducting these activities, naturally the army was not amused. Now Bhutto was placed under house arrest. Ultimately, as you know, he was tried for treason and put to death. And this was the coup that General Zia brought about. Now, before I make a few comments about Zia's role, and Zia's role was unmistakable in Pakistan history, and I don't know if I've made this clear by now, that in all of these developments, we're at circa 1977, maybe 30 years after the formation of Pakistan, and there's hardly any democratic tradition to be seen. I want to now contrast this to some developments that took place in India at that point in time. Developments that I mentioned to you earlier, ladies and gentlemen, which could have squarely justified reactionary behavior from the forces in Pakistan, but which saw the best of the Indian Armed Forces. By this I mean, firstly, the emergency, which was imposed in 1975. What Cohen described as Indira Gandhi's euphemism for a personalized dictatorship. The emergency itself was implemented at the advice of a very eminent counsel, Mr. S.S. Ray, who said that JP's public pronouncements that the army and police should act against the illegal orders of Indira Gandhi were enough to constitute a threat to internal security, justifying imposition of emergency. And even though the statesman like Mr. Kao, who headed the intelligence organization at the time, advised Mrs. Gandhi against the imposition of emergency, as you know, she proceeded to do it. She also superseded certain judges in the Supreme Court. Curiously enough, the imposition of emergency was never challenged in the Indian Supreme Court. And though the Supreme Court had already, in Keshavanand Bharati's case, made its presence felt at the political high table, this was one phase where the Supreme Court actually didn't acquit itself as well as it should have. Many of the judgments passed by the Supreme Court at this time were pro-emergency, pro-government, anti-fundamental rights, anti-the people, and this is something judges have said themselves. But the more important question for me here is, what role did the Indian Armed Forces play in carrying out the conduct of emergency in India? Defense Minister Bansilal assured the people that the army was never used. Well, this was a half-truth. Mrs. Gandhi had in fact summoned her three service chiefs and the army commanders from the Eastern and the Western Command, seeking their opinion as to whether they would support her in the emergency. All of them bluntly refused. Some have said General Manekshaw was even under house arrest. His biographer, General Shubhi Sood, who has spoken at BIC in his book, makes no such reference. But the other interesting development by then was that the Indian government, who suffered covertly from a sense of anxiety with the Indian Armed Forces, had already begun to develop what some have described as the Second Army. And that is the paramilitary troops, the Border Security Force, and the many other paramilitary forces that have come into being, which function not directly under the command of the army or the Ministry of Defense, but function under the Home Ministry. I don't know how far this is true. I see General Nagaraj vigorously shaking his head. I know I'm up for it later. But the fact remains that this perversion of democracy that took place was also never questioned by the army. Privately, a lot of Faujis were dead against what was happening. Funnily enough, a lot of people say 70s mein to army rule tha. Not quite. As I said, there is no provision even for military rule to be provided, and thankfully I would say, in the Indian constitution. So what can be put down as the reasons for this reaction from the Indian army? Well, its ethos, its sense of regimental izzat, its professional training and upbringing, its adherence to civilian command. The army didn't venture into questioning whether Mrs. Gandhi's decision was correct, or whether JP was the legitimate leader, or whether it was time now to impose one of their own as the president or as the prime minister, and so on. Some have said, tongue-in-cheek, that the armed forces were not very excited about having JP in power because that would give rise to a new form of austerity that they didn't like. I don't know. It seems like a light-hearted comment, and I think it's a light-hearted comment. But importantly, regardless of what failings the forces had, neither did they respond, and nor were they expressly used in this process. The fact that the democracy, the experiment with emergency was a complete disaster is summed up best by Mr. H.Y. Sharda Prasad, an old Mysorean, who said that once Mrs. Gandhi imposed emergency, she made sure that no other prime minister in Indian history would ever be tempted to resort to this sort of thing. So maybe she did us a favor. It reminds me of something that Ram Guha said recently at a talk. He said, the best way to break the dynastic traditions in India is to actually have Rahul Gandhi as Prime Minister. Please remember, Ram said it. Soon after the emergency, elections were held. Morarji Desai's government came into power. Later, the Congress returned in what is a seamless democratic experiment. Democracy was in full flow. And please, therefore, appreciate the passive role played by the armed forces in creating political space for democracy to be tested, to possibly fail, and to then again regain its ground. I know I'm running out of time, but I want to also refer very quickly to two other such episodes in the more recent history of India. One is Operation Blue Star. Now, this is the sort of experiment that civilians and officers alike have said should never have involved the armed forces. But be that as it may, Mrs. Gandhi was advised by her generals, General Vaidya, General Sundarji, who later blamed the intelligence for not really conveying the sort of gravitas of the situation. But the fact remains that this operation also was undertaken by the army without any protest, without dema. There was a minor revolt, one of the few times in the history of the Indian Armed Forces. Certain Jawans of the 9th Battalion of the Sikh Regiment in Ganganagar, Rajasthan, revolted. Certain others followed suit, but that was quickly suppressed. But the more important anecdote for me is what General Brar says. And General Brar, as you know, himself was a Sikh officer. He commanded the operations. And he said that when we went into the Golden Temple, on the verge of entering the Golden Temple, I saw that many of my officers and boys were Sikhs. And he said, normally I would never raise this question in the Indian Army, but this is one of those extreme situations where I think I can legitimately say that if any of you Sikh boys don't want to do this, just raise your hands. And he saw a number of hands going up. So he said, "ठीक है बेटे, मत करो." They said, "No, sir, हमको कुछ कहना है." So he said, "बोलो क्या कहना है?" He said, "Sir, हम पहले अंदर जाएंगे." Now this is a poignant lesson in secularism. We talk about liberal democracy, a lot of rhetoric in terms of secularism and being sensitive and civil society and so on. Well, this was a classic example to behold. Show me how many institutions on the ground in extreme situations like this can still lay claim to being purely secular as the Indian Army was. Please look at the IPKF in Sri Lanka, what is called India's Vietnam. We were sent in not very clear as to whether we were there as a fighting force, as a peacekeeping force. At one point, India had covertly trained militants of the LTTE. Later on, we wanted peace to be maintained. Then Prime Minister Gandhi sent our troops. And the Div Commander General Sardesh Pandey said the bluster of the GOC IPKF, the tentativeness and uncertainty of the army commander above him, and the army chief's loquaciousness did little to change the systemic incongruities and tackle the hidden rot. In fact, he was laying blame directly at the door of the senior military leadership. But General Dipinder Singh, who was the GOC at that point, said that the army was forced into an operation for which it was not fully ready. And even when the army was, and they believed in a position to declare a ceasefire, they were overruled by the Indian leadership. The political casualty, of course, was Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Before him, his mother succumbed as a result of the 1984 incursion. In fact, Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, in the introduction to General Dipinder's book on the IPKF operations, quotes a beautiful phrase or a beautiful stanza from the first epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 14, verse 8. He says, "For if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle?" And if the command from the leadership itself was unclear, was it fair to send the troops? Was it fair to have them picked like flies, not fully prepared for commando operations? And this I am not saying, I am no expert, but I believe I've read enough and got it from the horse's mouth that our boys were not ready for that operation. But be that as it may, the military was accustomed to political expediency. It was accustomed to being utilized in such endeavors, and never was there a finger raised. So this innings that India enjoyed, I think, speaks for itself. I want to now quickly go into the slogovers in Pakistan, because I think there the contrast becomes even more stark. I did refer to General Zia's rhetoric at the beginning. He later on, of course, said that the country can only be kept together by the armed forces, not by politicians. He reclaimed the nuclear arsenal. It started an arms race in South Asia and so on. He conducted a national referendum. But he went out of his way to suppress democracy. He made certain amendments to remove the president, whereby the president could unilaterally remove the prime minister, a sort of amendment that the Indian Supreme Court would never sustain. Ultimately, he fell out with the Americans. The ISI became more dominant. He died in an air crash. And after his time, the case of exploding mangoes, as some call it. And after his time, the army, decided against continuing any further martial law. It permitted elections. Please also notice this other very significant feature, that democracy in Pakistan functions only when the army permits it to function. So they were gracious enough to permit elections to be held, what resulted in what people call the decade of democracy. A decade that saw Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif come and go many times. Something that Shuja Nawaz has described as a troika, where the president, the prime minister and the army chief were all playing musical chairs, grappling for space. And no doubt this period had many civilian leaders, but it still didn't have democracy. If anything, it had greater autocracy, it had greater corruption, it had a less liberal tradition, if that's possible. And therefore, democracy continued to be stillborn in Pakistan. When it came to the appointment of the next army chief, there was a General Nawaz who was appointed by superseding some others. And in the many ironies that I have referred to, ladies and gentlemen, General Nawaz has been described by the New York Times and by other thinkers, eminent thinkers, as the greatest champion of democracy that Pakistan ever saw. I told you that General Yahya conducted the fairest of all elections. Well, General Nawaz refused his troops to be deployed in Sindh, even though the leadership wanted it. The Punjabis saw it as an act of collusion. He resisted martial law because he felt that only Parliament could introduce it. Now, this is the kind of pure constitutional democratic thought that one would expect civilian leaders to carry as flag bearers. Sadly or paradoxically, that was never to be. General Nawaz died of a heart attack on a treadmill. Some say he was poisoned. Well, that brought us to pretty much the last couple of overs that I'm going to take up before I expose myself to cross-examination. And General Karamat had by now taken over as Army Chief. Nawaz Sharif was in power. Nawaz Sharif continued to make an interesting choice as his predecessors had. He didn't fancy General Karamat too much. He removed him with someone who thought would be more supportive. Any guesses? Musharraf. Musharraf, friends, made some fantastic claims again. He said whenever the army gets involved in martial law, it gets distracted from its vital military duties. When we superimpose the military over the civilian government, the latter ceases to function. It's a different matter that he was there from 1999 to 2008. It was at this point that Kargil occurred. Kargil, as you know, was his brainchild. He was aggrieved by the fact that India beat Pakistan to Siachen. Kargil again. Pakistan was sent back with a bloody nose. We suffered our own casualties. We suffered lack of intelligence, leadership, so on. I don't really have the time to dwell on that. But the fact remains that by now, and we're talking about circa 1999-2000, the army was a fait accompli in the politics of Pakistan. Cohen said, the army appears to be unable to govern Pakistan itself, but will not allow anyone else the opportunity to do so either. Wilson Jones was more pithy. He said, it's an army's nation. Well, Musharraf ultimately had to pay the price after a great deal of to and froing. The local civil society of Pakistan also was fed up. He took on the judiciary. For once, the judiciary stood its ground. When Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry was sought to be removed, the sort of mass movement that took place amongst the advocate fraternity, the civil society, was terrific. One of the proposed amendments to the constitution was refreshingly quashed by the Supreme Court. General Kiani was appointed, and at such point in time, Musharraf knew his game is up. And he made his final address to his nation stating that he was going to graciously make way and perhaps move to Dubai, as many of them do. But in his final address to the nation, there was not a single mention of the word democracy. And Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto came together to release what they called a Charter of Democracy at the same time in 2007, a code of conduct for each other. But there was another very significant faux pas. And they said so. We shall not join a military regime or any military-sponsored government. No party shall solicit the support of the military to come into power or to dislodge a democratic government. A significant faux pas. The very fact that the civilian leaders had to impose this oath upon themselves betrayed the history of the nation. Ultimately, as you know, when Benazir Bhutto was at a rally in Rawalpindi under the nose of the army headquarters, what she described as a time when she was happy and thrilled but still unable to control her tears. She was shot in the head and in the neck. She died instantly. Well, ultimately, she was vindicated with the ouster of Musharraf. And then the new combine of Zardari and others came into power. This happened as of circa 2008. But the question as to how long this arrangement will continue in Pakistan, friends, is only a question of time. And I want to give the last word here to the Indian Army. General Vaz, in a sense, said some of the things I said. He said that the military ensured internal stability and kept scrupulously aloof even in tailor-made coup situations, such as those prevailing during emergency. But he did go on to wistfully say that the Indian Ex-Services League has resolved not to participate in any political activity as an organization. The self-imposed ban may have been valid during its formative years, but there are many who would like a new ex-servicemen's political organization to emerge. And this is not because the army wants to wear a new political avatar. It's because we as a people have not regarded the army sufficiently. The fact that we have Gallantry Award winners returning their medals and burning artificial limbs, I think, is a slap on the face of civil society. We need to, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, for all the failings that the army may have, step back for a minute and appreciate its apolitical and secular nature. If we are able to very conclusively find that the frequent conduct of coups in Pakistan has completely destroyed democracy, we must also be proud that the non-event of a coup has enabled democracy in India. We must not, therefore, let the army become an anachronism. We must appreciate its political relevance, and we must also appreciate its social relevance. I was at pains to point out that secular, apolitical institutions are as critical to Indian society as are those in government. We must therefore remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the role of the army is not only significant in wartime, but it is equally, if not more significant, in peacetime. We must also remember that they also serve who only stand and wait. Thank you.